Hello everyone, how are y'all doing tonight? Great. Great. Well, my name's Sage. I'm an AmeriCorps member serving at Lake County Conservation District, and welcome to our conservation speakers series. This year's theme is pollinators and plantings, and this is the final part of our three-part series for the year. But we do have lots of other events upcoming, such as our pollinator initiative, where Lake County residents can get free pollinator seed. If you'd like to learn more about that, I can talk to y'all about it at the end. We have lots of handouts and information on that. And you can also sign up for a newsletter if you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming events. If you are online on Zoom, there will be a survey at the end where you can leave your email, and if you're in person, you can just come up and talk to me. We also have our website where you can watch recordings of past events and see upcoming stuff, as well as our Facebook page. We will be taking questions at the end, meanwhile, so if you have any questions on Zoom, you can put that in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those. And yeah, we'll have like a 15-minute period for questions. But without further ado, Janene, how can you take it away?
All right, thanks, Sage.
Yeah.
And so, as you've already heard, I'm Janene Lichtenberg, and I work at Salish Kootenai College in the Wildlife and Fisheries Department. And I'm talking to you today about bumblebees and flowers. Neither one of these would be things I consider myself an expert in at all. In fact, how I ended up working with bumblebees started with huckleberries. How I started working with huckleberries started with an interest in bears and wildlife foods. And so, just a disclaimer at the beginning of kind of where my level of expertise falls in the information I'm sharing with you today. And I would guess it's likely a lot of you know more about some of these topics than I do. And so, also at the end, I'd love to talk some more and learn some more from each of you. Oh, it was working. No.
Oh no, I can.
Oh well, yep.
I will click for you.
That works too. So I'd like to start with the thank yous. I'd like to say how grateful I am to be here in the lands of the Kaliska, Salish, and Pasanka Band of Kootenai people, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and all of their support of the projects that we've been doing, the Culture Committee, the Tribe Natural Resources Department, the Tribes Wildlife Management Program, and their Environmental Protection Division have all in various ways supported and contributed to the work I'm talking about today. Next, I'd like to thank the many, many students. I was trying to figure out before I came today how many students have worked on this project at this point. We've had 4 years that we've been working with Bumble Bees, and I would say there's been around 20 at least student projects that have somehow been related to this work. Dr. Tabitha Graves with the U.S. Geological Survey. She is a big part of also how I became involved with and interested in this work. She has a bigger huckleberry project that she was also working on with her interest in bears and bear foods. And so she, with that, wanted to learn more about how huckleberries might be changing with climate change. And she set up these stations around Glacier National Park with remote time-lapse cameras that also had motion detection. And she started watching and sending crews out to look at, through time, how huckleberries at different elevations and different aspects might be changing as far as when they first flower, when they first have ripe berries, etc. We expanded that to the Flathead Reservation in 2016, I think. And so for a couple of years, this project really was focused on huckleberry phenology, just seeing how huckleberries were doing at different sites, watching all kinds of fun things happen on the remote game cameras when we're not there, and even when we are. And some of these pictures today even will be from those remote cameras. In fact, I'm pretty certain that one in the top right, left, depending on how you're looking at this, was a remote camera photo. Rebecca Brassfield has been a huge help. She's been working the last few years with the students and crews out in the field. And doctors Anthony Berthelot and Deanna Bell-Belton have contributed in various ways. And then the funding has come from the National Science Foundation, the Environmental Protection Agency, American Indian College Fund, And all of you, thanks for being here tonight. Thank you, Lake County Conservation District, for inviting me. And there we go. I'm grateful. Well, pollinators. For those of you who have maybe more familiar, some of you less familiar, I thought I should put a definition, but really pollination is anything that moves pollen grains from one flower to another. And so pollinators are usually just any kind of animal that's visiting a flower and then moving pollen around. We amazingly, I thought it was really amazing myself at least, had those remote cameras up on huckleberry plants and had hummingbirds come in. Beautiful, sharp, lovely pictures of hummingbirds. The first one I saw, I actually was looking through photos and I said, oh my gosh, a hummingbird is a huckleberry. My husband said, oh, I'm sure he's just checking it out. I'm like, no, it's stopping. And then we had hummingbirds in the rain, hummingbirds in the middle of the night. When the huckleberry plants have nectar, it's super sweet and sugary, and lots of things want to come and eat that nectar. And so that's what the hummingbirds are doing. And of course, they're putting their bill in the flower eating nectar. They're likely moving some pollen grains around. Are they moving as much around as a bumblebee? Well, certainly not, but still really cool as an animal that's a pollinator. And for all plants, really insects are the primary pollinators. They are the ones that are visiting the most, moving the pollen grains around the most. And still doesn't work on mine.
Oh gosh, okay. So next. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a break or a pause and see if we can put it back.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure it out. I can't, I'm not sure. Here, let me just, 1 second.
Oh, it's doing that as a screen.
Why is it doing that? I don't know.
Flip it and see if I
Yeah, if you
tell
can
too.
figure this out. So when I go to here,
Oh, it's the shared screens.
and I can't figure out how to get it to go back.
Yeah, see with my computer, there's like a screen thing. I don't know if that's the same one. It looks like it. If you put it, it'll ask. There you go.
Oh,
So what you want to do is you want to duplicate.
So if I
Now
go
we're
to-
on camera.
I know, I just.
Look
Maybe
up
if I
and
go
look,
to
here we are.
here, share, and then, no. That's so weird.
Right, because what it's doing is it's
Wait,
in a
display settings, okay.
Yeah, and I don't care if it's in presenter mode. Obviously, I can't see the presenter anyway. If we want to just put it in just the regular slide mode. No, that's not it. Go to display settings.
Yeah, it's like not letting me click it.
What if you go to end slideshow and start it over?
True, okay. So let's just.
Yeah,
use
restart the slideshow. And then just go to the, where's the,
Go to Zoom, share
right?
screen,
And then, yeah.
share.
And then wait before you do anything more here. This is where we're gonna go, maybe try to see if you can just put it, hit that there so it just goes to the slides.
There we go, perfect, okay. So is this where, or
Going back to
these, right here?
There we go. All right.
Great.
So insects are the main pollinators of flowers, flowering plants. And of the insects, bees are especially important because they are specifically visiting the flowers to feed on the pollen and in addition to the nectar. And so they are purposely collecting the pollen and moving the pollen around, not just incidentally going to drink some nectar like the hummingbird and then happening to move some pollen. So all of our native bees have setae that are bristles, like hairs. If you look at a bumblebee, they kind of look like they're hairy or fuzzy or furry to you. This is these bristles that help catch the pollen. And all of the bees have this. Many of the bees, in addition, have a special bag that they actually pack the pollen into, which we'll talk to a little more as well. It's not really a bag, but like a space on their leg, people sometimes call pollen bags.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh,
That's me.
it's working. Nice.
Oh my God. Now I've been breaking. Yeah, it was victory. So a lot of people are unaware that how many native bees there are. So bees are in the group Hymenoptera, and the superfamily that includes what we call bees are specifically the insects in Hymenoptera that feed on the pollen and nectar, as we already said. And there's over 20,000 species of bees in the world. I'll let that thing sink in. We typically know like a couple of them, right? And most of these bees are really different than what we think about when we think about bee. Most are stingless. Most are solitary animals that don't live in like the big colony hives like you think with the European honeybee. Some of them are super small, smaller than a grain of rice. And as you can see at the bottom here, these are not our photos. Sam Droege is an incredible entomologist who takes beautiful photos. And all those little colorful insects at the bottom there, all are bees. Very little is known about most of them.
It's not working.
Honeybees. So as I was looking for a photo of honeybee today, I realized that this was the first one that I was able to find. And then I was not able to find another in the time I had. If you look really closely, you can see that this European honeybee is being fed on by a spider. Which is why I took the photo. So honeybees, European honeybees, they're one of 20,000 species of bees. And they were introduced to North America. They're, of course, the bee that most of us are most familiar with and know most about because we manage them for honey. They have huge colonies and they go out and they gather the pollen. They bring it back to the hives. So they're excellent pollinators as well, but they aren't native to the United States. They're kind of like the cattle of the bee world. In the US, so 20,000 species of bees in the world, 3,600 species of native bees in the US. So again, this hugely diverse group of little insects that we're not all that aware of that are super duper important for pollination. Bumblebees. These are another group. These are kind of your bigger, fuzzier bees that you see around because they're large and more people are more familiar with them. But most people aren't aware that there's also lots and lots of species of bumblebee. So again, worldwide, 255 species. And in North America, 49 species of bumblebees. Bumblebees also live in colonies, which also is the reason why they're excellent for pollination, is because they are specifically trying to collect pollen, keep the pollen with them, and bring the pollen back to their colonies. Their colonies are a little smaller than your European honeybees. They tend to be 50 to 500 individuals. Bumblebees are really cool because they have this special ability called sonication, where they can vibrate their wing muscles super duper fast. And this actually helps them warm up their bodies so that they can be warm at temperatures where most other insects can't. And so this is really important too, because we have our early flowering plants out like right now. Bumblebees are really good at being active and moving around among the flowers that are early and colder temperatures and higher elevations. They also use the sonication for gathering pollen. People sometimes call it buzz pollination. If you listen closely, that's exactly what they're doing, is as they vibrate those muscles, you hear this buzzing sound that's happening, and they're shaking those pollen grains out of the flowers. And for some plants and flowers, that's one of the only ways to get those pollen grains out. And so another reason bumblebees can be super important for pollination. As I said, most bumblebees live in colonies. That said, there's exceptions to everything. And of the 49 bumblebees in the US, we have 6 species, 3 that actually occur in our area of Montana, that are considered to be cuckoo bumblebees. See this close again, they have the setae on their legs here, those hairs for collecting pollen. They do not have that special space for packing the pollen in, as I'll show you on a future photo. Why they don't have colonies that they're trying to bring pollen back, so they're just collecting the pollen and nectar for their own food, so they can eat it themselves, and then moving the pollen around as they go from plant to plant. The name cuckoo comes from their nest parasites, just like cuckoo birds lay their eggs in other birds' nests. The cuckoo bumblebees leave their young in the nests of other bumblebees to raise and feed. But most bumblebees have these, what people call pollen baskets. You see how that's smooth where that last slide, you can see how it's all fuzzy? That's how you can tell these cuckoo bumbles from the others. There it is, my arrow. There it is. All right. And so they call this a curvicula, this pollen bag. And European honeybees have these too. Again, they've got to go back. They've got to bring this pollen back to feed the young in the hive. And so they're going to have this extra ability to pack in lots of extra pollen on their legs. They look close too in this photo we took. You see this particular bumblebee has a couple little mites. We see that a lot, all these different mites that parasitize the bumblebees. And this is what it looks like when a bumblebee is carrying pollen in its curvicula. And so these are some of the photos we've taken that you can see that the pollen grains are different colors. And different flowers have different colored pollen grains. And then the pollen grains themselves have different structure to them. And so we actually have a student at SKC right now who's been trying to figure out how to build a pollen library. Basically going into flowers, collecting the pollen grains from those flowers, taking them to under microscopy, looking at them through a microscope, getting the kind of details of identification. And then his whole plan with this and hope is that eventually somebody could find a bumblebee like this, knock a little pollen off of its curvicula, let the bumblebee go, and then from the pollen grains themselves, figure out what flowers those bees were visiting. So bumblebees are really important pollinators, as we've talked about, not just for wildflowers, but for crops. They visit lots of different plants. Different species tend to have different plants that they prefer. And some flowers are more attractive than others, but these are some pictures all of local bees on local flowers. See, this is a wild rose and aster, I think chokecherry, and larkspur or camas. No, this is camas. Camas for sure. And I forget what, a penstemon in that upper corner. So again, buzz pollination or the sonication, where they shake these pollen grains out. A lot of plants actually are really dependent on this: tomatoes, eggplants, blueberries, huckleberries and the blueberry family, and potatoes. So you're looking at a flower like this. Some of them have anthers that you have to shake the pollen out to really get that pollen out. And so those bumblebees are extra good at doing that. And then things like blueberries and huckleberries have fused petals. And so it's harder to get that pollen out without this being able to go up to the flower and shake it really hard. Native bees, including the bumblebees, are very difficult to identify. Obviously, things the size of a grain of rice are super duper hard. And so little known about so many of those 3,600 native bees in the US, let alone the 20,000 in the world. And bumblebees are a little easier since they're often bigger. And they do have some unique color patterns, but even still, in the end, they are really, really tough. And most entomologists will tell you that you can't truly identify with perfect confidence that a bumblebee is the species you think it is unless you lethally kill it and put it under a microscope and look at all of the different structural details. That said, there are different characteristics that you can use to look at to have a general idea or to at least get a likelihood of these are likely the species you are looking at. And some have some really unique markings that you can really tell them for sure. But some of the problems that happen are that the females look different than the males. And we'll talk a little bit about life history, but that leads to some issues of which species you have when you have different color variations with the males and the females. And then within a species, there's often a lot of similarities and then a lot of differences too. And so you'll have species that you'll see if you look really close on here. I'm trying to find one and I'm not finding an example very quickly. Others are right here. So there you go. So this is Rufocinctus. And you see like this color pattern to show there. This is also Rufocinctus. No. And you can see how really different it looks. And then if you look closely, you can see how much Rufocinctus looks like some of these other bees over here. And suddenly what you think you had figured out is really difficult. And so it's not as simple as one might hope. There's some around here that are really distinctive. This one here, paucitus is known as the white shouldered bumblebee. When you see them in that color phase, that white shoulder is super distinct, super obvious, and doesn't look like any other bumblebee we have around here. So there are some things like that where you can tell the bee by knowing where we're at. But yeah, it's not as easy as you'd hope. And as much as we've been trying, we start feeling really good and we're like catching people like, yes, I know what this is. And then you start looking at another one, you're like, oh, wait, maybe not. And so we'll talk some more about some of the other characteristics too. But this is a general, pretty decent idea, at least as a way. And this is from the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. And so they're trying to find some ways to help people learn what bees they're seeing and take photos and send them in to get better identification on different bumblebees. Oh, there it is. So this is typically what people are looking at. This is again kind of showing the whole piece of within the species even, you got variation in size between the queens, the males, the females. You can a lot of cases have differences in colorations. But our hope with our project truly was to find some ways that we could learn as much as we could about bumblebees while being as using lethal methods as little as possible. Part of the reason why, again, is how I started being interested in this particular project was huckleberries. Huckleberries flower really early. And as we were watching on our cameras and we were watching in the field, the main bees that are coming out when the huckleberries are flowering are the queen bees. And the queen bees are starting out, they've been in hibernation. They're getting ready to start the next colony. And they're coming out for food. And they need to get as much food as they can before they start the next colony. Then they start their brood, the female workers hatch out, the queen stays and takes care of things, and those workers head out in the field and bring pollen and nectar back. If you lose a queen, you've lost an entire colony. And so we really especially did not want to have that kind of an impact on the bumblebees. And so the Pacific Northwest Bee Atlas that I mentioned, they've had this program going for a while where they're capturing bees, photographing bees, letting bees go. And so Tabitha Graves, also my collaborator, we also were working on what can we do to find some ways to go out in the field, catch some bees, take some photographs, let them go, and feel somewhat good about the identification of these somewhat difficult to identify animals. Oops. There we go. So here's one of the meadow sites where we have worked. You can see that this is early season with the larkspur blooming, and lots of bumblebees enjoy larkspur. We had a standardized methods where we go out with our nets for 45-minute sweeps in a given area and catch all the bumblebees we could. And you think, oh my gosh, well, what did you do with those bumblebees then? Because obviously we can't photograph them all immediately. So we paused the timer and we put them in a cooler. There's more pictures capturing bees at the huckleberry sites. Removing bees from the nets. Bumblebees are incredibly docile. Of all of the different people I've had work on this project, I have had one person be stung. That person was stung because they decided to really handle the bumblebee. They're like, bumblebees never sting. Look at this, look at that. Ouch, I got stung. That's how much work it took to get stung by the bumblebees. So truly, you want to be careful. You don't want to get stung, obviously, and especially if you might have a bee allergy. But they don't want to sting you if they can help it. And so actually they're pretty easy to get out of the nets. They're trying to buzz up to the top. You can take the net and hold on to it. You can take a little vial and put it under. And then if you turn it over, they want to fly up. So just fly right up into the vial, stick your little cap on, you have your bumblebee. So then we put them in the cooler on ice, restart our timers, and keep sweeping for bees. And we would do this when the temperatures were warm. It's the most likely time you can have the most active bees. When the wind was not too windy, because they obviously don't like to fly when there's a lot of wind. This was the ideal. I say insured, I should have reworded this. Initially we insured, and we very quickly found out that, especially at high elevation sites, it wasn't very often that we were going to hit this perfect window of conditions. And also bumblebees are active beyond the window. But we had to make a lot of notes about that because we were trying to standardize our capture efforts with this time and space. And of course, we're working in different temperatures. Which bees will be out and how many are going to change or be different. This is out actually at the key horse mitigation parcels, and we might recognize in the valley. And so although we started with Huckleberries, we have then had some students and some work that's moved down into the valley and looked at bees in the valley as well. So this is a cooler with a bee that's been chilled. And they are truly chill after you cool them down. You can pick them up and handle them. If they're cool enough, they go to full-on torpor, where they're basically asleep with no movement at all. And so this makes it so that you can actually take them and move them around and take lots of different pictures. And as you're doing this, they eventually start warming up. They eventually start moving around more and more. And then you can actually warm them in your hands for a while to help them warm up faster if you're done, and they fly away. We've also captured a lot of things that like to try to look like bees. These are flies we've captured off of plants. I love this one. We're certain we've caught this one a bunch of times now. You think you've got a bumblebee, you're all excited about your bumblebee, you pull your bumblebee up and you look, it's got these great big eyes. And you look closer and you say, this is a fly. This is not a bumblebee again. And then these cool moths. I get so excited when I find these moths. Both of these moths we captured on the huckleberry plants and sites. And similarly, you can see they look an awful lot like a bumblebee. Of course, with their wings out, you can see the wings as well right now. But if you see them out of a flower and you're not really looking close, and their wings are sometimes back too, they look so very bumblebee-like.
Stop working.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's just handy, I guess.
oh,
There we go.
there it goes.
And this is what I'm sitting on. I think actually my son took this picture while I was holding it. Beautiful animals that look like bumblebees, but are not. And we also captured other native bees. And so there's a lot of different native bees out there, and a lot of them do look like bumblebees until you get them up close. And you can see this particular one, how it's got all these pollen grains on its leg. A lot of them have special structures on their abdomens to carry pollen around too. And then of course they've got all those bristles. So again, chilling them in the cooler. We did just use some really hardy, small packable field cameras. And so camera technology's gone a long ways. And I was glad for that, so we didn't have to get big, expensive, you know, big cameras like you would have to in the past. This is Rebecca Brassfield, who's done a lot of work on this project now. So this is the cameras that we've been using. It's a little Olympus. We chose this one with help from Tabitha also and some other people who were doing bee photography and close-up photography. Really high resolution. It has a macro mode that's just great for getting up close and having good focus. It has these LED ring lights. And what's really been useful is this image stacking. And that is what it looks like. I should have put for a comparison without the image stacking. But we've gotten some fabulous photos. You got to think this is out in the field, sitting on top of a cooler, a cool bee with a little point and shoot camera. Problem with image stacking is not that, but that. If they move at all, you get all those different images that were stacked in all of the different poses that the bee was moving in. Or in this case. Had some fun photos, as you can imagine. And so some of the photos in the talk today were before we had the image stacking cameras and before we had the ring light cameras. And so you'll see the lower quality photos are the early photos, and these higher quality photos are the later photos. Also, something if you want to go into your own bee photography that we found through time at the ring light and everything is having a gray background is your best color of background out there. Most of the other colors don't work quite as well. It's just something I'm sure with the lighting. And so these are some of our photos, and I've been really pleased and excited with some of the really beautiful photos we've had. Females are what we're using for identification, trying to avoid the males that come out later in the season. Males are basically around for breeding with the new queens. And they're really hard even for expert bumblebee entomologists and people to identify. These are the structures you're wanting to take pictures of too. You want to get these kind of a different tertiary on the back of the bee. You're wanting to get the thorax here, some of the leg structures, and especially the face. A lot of what people are looking at is face length and different structures on the face and antennae as well. And so here's some of the kind of close-ups of faces. Some bumblebees have longer tongues than the other bumblebees. In fact, people call them the long-tongued bumblebees and the short-tongued bumblebees. And we had a student, Aspen Jager, who looked at the bees that we had caught and the species we know have long tongues, the species we know have short tongues, and then looked at the flower corolla lengths. And not surprisingly, there was a pretty good correlation with the long-tongued bees feeding on the longer corolla flowers than the short-tongued bees. See things like face color too. Keep forgetting how the laser pointer. That's a nice little fuzzy face. The thorax pattern. This bee here has a beautiful notch. That's a good identification for that species. And so we have captured over 15 species of bumblebees of the 28 that we know of in the US. So it's kind of exciting considering we haven't been limited in our scope of kind of where we're visiting, how often we're out, all of that. So I'm sure we have more species here. And we're hoping we can continue to learn more and more about the flower associations of these bumblebees and what sites we find different species and things like that. So I figured I'd show you a few of these buzzy buddies. This is the Blackjail Bumblebee. And these are two different individuals of the same species. No. Yes. These are the IDs, by the way, on these photos I'm about to show you all came from our expert in bumblebee identification, Amy Dolman. And so she has a confidence, even though she also said she was confident, some of course she wasn't. She goes through all the photos we send her and she says, gives a scale. I'm confident it's the species. I think it's a species. I forget what her scale is exactly. The species. I feel okay with this identification. I'm just not sure, and I have no clue. Not based on her ID skills, but based on our photography skills. So here is a black-tailed bumblebee, and you can see its tail is not black. If you look really close, the very last tertiary, but you might not see that if you're not looking closely. That's some of the reason we have to have these bees up close and chilled, and somebody who really knows what they're looking at identify them for us. This is also the black-tailed bumblebee, right? So just kind of, again, differences in color variations, differences in appearance, the need to really see lots of photos. Look at how much pollen that girl is carrying. That is a lot, and it's just amazing, really. This is the black-notched bumblebee. This is one that I typically feel pretty good about when I find it because it has usually this really lovely notch. And it's a fairly common bee around here too. But there's exceptions and there's other bees that get that similar look to them, and so it's not a perfect ID either. This is the white-shouldered bumblebee I told you about. You can see that that white in the front when they have it is really distinct. Someone has a little bit of pollen. There we go. Some speed. Backwards, forwards. There we go. There you go. Central bumblebee. The golden northern bumblebee. The yellow fronted bumblebee. The brown belted bumblebee. That's bumblebee. Mixed bumblebee. And as you're looking, you're going, oh, they look a lot alike. Or maybe you're like, hey, some of these are really cool and different. The Nevada bumblebee, that's another one that often is more unique than some of the others and easier to identify. Western bumblebee. This is a species that's of conservation concern right now. It is currently being petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act, the candidate species. And if you look closely, you can see that sometimes some of them have this real white rump that can help you identify this species. And we are capturing them in Lake County. Red-belted bumblebee. Sitka bumblebee, these ones often look extra fluffy. They have black bumblebee. And then a couple of cuckoo bumblebees. The indiscriminate cuckoo. And Ferdinand's cuckoo.
Of course.
Cuckoos are interesting because some of them are fairly uncommon too, right? Because we have bees that are declining bumblebees and they are totally dependent on the bumblebees that they parasitize. So they tend to be even less common. And I know some of them, there's some concern with as Western bumblebees have been declining so quickly that some of the cuckoo bumblebee species that depend on them are as well. I put in some pretty flowers, some of our sites that are visited by bumblebees. This is a larkspur, lupin, and penstemon. These are dominant flowers. This is not necessarily like bees love these flowers more than any other flowers. These are the dominant flowers of the site, and we know bumblebees visited them. And so just some more of the sulfur buckwheat, the aster, owl's clover. And then we had a student who did focal observations specifically of plants to see which ones were visited the most by bumblebees of the plants she was looking at. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean these are the best plants for bumblebees. It means that she was looking at this list of bees and the nodding onion, the wild rose, the fiddleberry, and the bitterroot. She's focusing on some of the food plants and culturally significant plants were visited more in her observations than the monarda or the biscuit. But all of these are, again, flowers that will be visited by bumbles. And then some more pretty flower pictures. And yet some more. And then finally, the huckleberry flowers, wrapping back around to how I ended up looking at bumblebees to begin with. And these are the different species of bumblebee we've captured on huckleberries. And you can see here that this Melanopodus, the Blackjail Bumblebee, was by far the most common, followed by the Mixtus and Bifarius, the black-notched bumblebee. And then least of all, these other species. Also, as I'd already mentioned, predominantly queen bees, further kind of, I think, showing that it's likely that huckleberries are really important for those queen bees when they first emerge out of hibernation in those huckleberry areas. And that bumblebees really, the huckleberries really need these bumblebees for pollination because they're some of the only insects that are out and active in the early season when huckleberries are flowering. What is that there? And so just from observations, this is actually from one of our cameras. We've actually had probably 30 pictures or more that we found that had bumblebees visiting on camera. And we think, that also bumblebees are really important for huckleberry because of those fused petals, that bell-shaped, and makes it harder to get in and move that pollen around. What we really started wondering is how important is this pollination to the huckleberries themselves? You go through the literature, you start looking at related plant species like different varieties of blueberries. Most of the work actually looking at the value of pollination to berry production on plants that we cultivated crops. And some cultivars of blueberry almost totally need bumblebees, and others do a lot more self-pollinating and actually do pretty well at berry production without bumblebees. And so we wanted to look a little more closely, just because bumblebees visit huckleberry flowers a lot didn't necessarily mean that that was important for actually having a lot of huckleberries. And so we did this exclusion study. We found 120 plants in an area that we'd already been watching on camera. And we put these bags, student Marcy Mead sewed 60 bags plus for us, so we could cover 60 huckleberry plants before the flowers are in bloom. And we placed those over half of our study plants to keep the bees out. And any other, we hope, pollinators too. But since we know mostly bees can't fit through that screen, we were virtually keeping pollinators out of half of those plants. Half of the plants were, anybody could come and go, and bumblebees could visit the flowers. Then to be sure that it, whoops, wants to move faster than I want to be sure that the difference wasn't those enclosures affecting somehow what's happening with pollination. We also hand pollinated half of the plants. So what you're looking at is we have 120 plants. We have 60 plants in bags. And then we would go out as often as we could. We made sure we never went more than 3 days without hand pollinating. And so we would take the bags off 30 of the plants, and we would sit with a pollen wand and we would try our best to buzz pollinate. Pollen grains are so small in huckleberry, you can't even see them. You're wondering if you're even doing anything at all. And we moved those around, those pollen wands, all the flowers on a plant, put it back in the bag. And we did that, and half of those in the bag and half of those out of the bag to just see if we could get some idea with hand pollination and extra pollination, what that might look like for the berries. And so this is different groups of people. It's my husband Dennis and Marcy who sewed all the bags for us out of looking at the plants and hand pollinating and making notes and watching bees and things like that. And we kept track anytime we saw a flower visited by a bumblebee. And we also did timed observations where we timed and looked at just one plant for 15 minutes at a time and just recorded every visitor. And it was hard to find students because our low elevation site, which was most accessible, was flowering during spring quarter. Everyone was really, really busy. So I had to draw a lot of my 3 sons and husband to help out in the field because there was no way I was hand pollinating 60 plants every 3 days by myself. And once the flowering was over, we were also just tracking through time. We took the nets off. So we hopefully weren't doing anything more to affect the plant growth. And then they were just free like all the other plants. And it was really obvious, really quickly as we kept going back to these sites and looking at these plants for the season, that the plants that were not in enclosures were getting a lot of berries really fast. The plants that were hand pollinated, we were seeing more berries. And those plants that were in those enclosures at the beginning during flowering and that didn't have any hand pollination, for the most part, were not producing berries at all. And so it was pretty obvious pretty quick that there's an importance and a difference. But as they ripened, we picked the berries and put them in vials. We took them back to a lab. We counted them in the field. We counted them again in the lab. We weighed all these berries and we put them into a deep freeze. And we did that till all of the berry ripening was complete. Tracked all of the different plants and the number of berries. And this is what it looked like. Almost 10 times more berries on the pollinated treatment plants than on the plants that were excluded from pollination. That's what you're looking at here, right? All pollination excluded, no hand pollination, bees can't get there. Of all those plants, 63 berries, 30 plants. And then you're looking over here, our hand pollination did something. Look at all these treatments, right? This is the one where the bumblebees couldn't get in. We still had 365 berries on those 30 plants. And then, of course, where we have the natural pollination with the bumblebees, we've got 545 berries. And then where we had the bumblebees could come in and we hand pollinated 650 berries among those plants. We thought that this might make a difference in seed counts too. And Erin, who is in the room right now, raise your hand, Erin. She was one of the great helpers in counting seeds from berries. Because initially, really, that's where people see a lot of the differences in seed counts. Like you might see, like we have a lot of berries, but a lot of those berries without pollination might not have very many seeds or very healthy seeds. We think this is observational, visual, that those seeds look smaller and different color. We don't know if that has anything to do with the viability of those seeds or not. Of the subset of 63 only berries among 30 plants. So in conclusion, pollinators are really important. They're really important for lots of things. They're really important for lots of foods we like to eat. And they're obviously super important if we want berries from huckleberry plants. And we know that bumblebees are the most common huckleberry flower visitor. We know that they're excellent pollinators. We know they're moving the pollen around. And with this work, we can also then see that without them doing so, there's far fewer berries on huckleberry plants. Why is this important? Well, of course, people love huckleberries. Lots of wildlife like huckleberries. And bears are big feeders on huckleberries. This is coming from some data from Martika and Campbell in 1986, where they looked at bear diets and the proportion of different things in their diets. And if you look at their annual diet, huckleberries made about 15% of all the food they're eating throughout the year. Now you gotta think about there's a window of huckleberry berries on the plants. And in that window, greater than half of the food during their study and their diets when huckleberries are ripe were huckleberries. So pretty important stuff. Bumblebees in North America, this is the depressing part of this talk now. They're not doing so great. Of the bees that we know things about, which is not most of them that we do know a lot about are not doing well. So gray is data deficient for bumblebees. Green is the least concerned for bumblebees. And then of course the yellow, orange, red is going into the most concerned for their conservation. And 12 of those 29 species are right now species that people are pretty concerned about. There's one bee in the eastern US that's on the endangered species list. And then as I mentioned, we have this western bumblebee that is potentially going to be listed because of rapid declines in their numbers, the bee that we can find here in Lake County. Pretty cool bee too, What can you do to help? Plant flowers. And so with the pollinator initiative, right? Get your flowers out there. Native flowers, a lot of our native bees are also connected to native plants, and so native flowers are great. You can have flowers that are in the area they belong, in the habitat where they belong. It's going to be where the bees that are used to them are going to hopefully be too. Leaving your brush piles. Bumblebees around here mostly are in burrows. They like rodent burrows and things. So they basically climb down into those burrows, they hibernate. They leave, come up in the next year, and then they build their new colonies underground in this rodent tunnels, other holes in the ground. A lot of our other native bees like hollow stems. And so even things as simple as like leaving your raspberry canes just a little bit longer in your garden so those native bees have enough time to hatch out and develop can be really helpful. Minimizing pesticide use. A lot of insects, bees included, are really sensitive to different pesticides and herbicides. And finally, you can share your photographs too, if you would like. There's a couple of ways to do that, but I guess I'll talk about the life cycle briefly first because I got my slides out of order. This is, we're talking about the queen emerging in the spring. She is gravid, she's getting the food that she needs. If it's in a huckleberry area, probably dependent on huckleberry flowers for the most part. Then she's coming into this burrow underground, laying eggs, raising the larvae. The first ones to hatch out are the female workers. Then they continue to bring the food back to the nest and keeping more and more workers going until late summer, when the new queen emerge, the males emerge, we have breeding, and then in bumblebees, they all die except for the new queens. And then those new queens go find a place to hibernate, and they go into hibernation, come out again, start the cycle again in the spring. Ways you can use your photos. There's bumblebewatch.org. They have places where you can submit photos, and then they look and try to help identify and figure out what bees are where. So one way that you can help with that. And I'm missing 2 slides, it looks like, because I also had 2 other places to go for great places for information. Is the Xerces Society, XERCES, has a lot of really great information on native pollinators and bees. And then the Pacific Northwest Atlas, Bumblebee Atlas. And in addition to submitting photos on that bumblebewatch.org, you can actually choose a site. They have all these different grids. And you choose a grid and actually go do your own surveys too. And so with that, we'll take any questions. People want to know about bumblebees.
Oh,
Yes.
With the non-native plants, are there a lot of studies about if the bees are using them as an alternate source? Are they getting enough?
Sure, they're definitely useful for the bees. They're definitely providing for some of the bees' needs. There's some research out there looking at it. Rebecca Brassfield, who was working on this project, is now working on her master's degree on that topic in part. She's actually looking at what bees need as far as their nutrients, and then looking at what plants and flowers supply it and when. So a little bit of work out there, not as enough as there needs to be, and certainly some differences in how different plants have, what nutrients they have and how that might matter to the bees. Yes.
Thinking about where the bees nest underground and in relation to whatever. Is there much danger to them when they do it in the spring?
Well, that is a great question. I don't know the answer to that. My first thought would be that there would have been natural burns, and so they are hopefully, in good shape for that underground. But I would guess a hot fire might have an impact. I don't know for sure. Good question.
Because if you look at nesting brush piles and in areas where the flowers are on stalks. So,
Right, so some of our native bees that are in those brush piles and in those stems, definitely, if you can wait to burn, it can help them get
and then
to the next phase of their lives.
Roadsides, burning pastures,
Right.
the pastures are.
Yeah, no, for some of those species of bees, native bees definitely it would have an impact. For bumblebees themselves, they're under the ground more. I'm not sure. Yes, Georgia.
So great presentation as always. So you had a pie chart that showed the native species of bumblebees, and there were like 3 species that were pretty dominant. So I was curious, do all of the native bumbles have equal propensity to pollinate huckleberries, or is there some competition going on with these 3 big groups that you saw?
Sure, I don't know if it's so much about competition as it just seems that they're kind of out busy doing their thing, and some species are more abundant doing it than others. And then some are not as common in those sites. That's sorry.
I was just wondering, Janene, if there's a common theme for the ones that are becoming more endangered. Are they species that are more specialized, or is there just some common threat, overriding threat that's for those species?
I'm not sure about the answer to that either.
Okay.
I would guess that the research is out there though, where you could find an answer to that. And I know that Tabitha Graves has been doing work with the Western Bumblebee here in Montana too, and might have some more answers to that.
Well, I thought it was interesting how you referred to, honeybees as kind of the cattle of the bee world. Do you think there's any correlation between honeybees and maybe the prevalence of non-native, noxious weeds or something like that here in the Mission Valley? I talked with, I was actually talking with Arlie Aviaries a little bit ago, and they mentioned, for their business, and obviously they're running honeybees, the weed species are a benefit to them. They don't mind the knapweed or anything like that. And they find that they can, have certain flavors of honey based on, the huckleberry species, I guess, in the area or something like that. So yeah, I just didn't know if you had any speculation.
I don't know if that's leading to an increase in the weeds by having that extra pollination. I do know that the bumblebees also will visit the knapweed, but they won't preferentially visit it. And from what it seems from some of the work that one of the students was doing, which was specific to that, what dominant flowers were out of kicking horse at the same time as knapweed, they're visiting the other flowers much more than their prevalence would suggest, and the knapweed much less than its abundance would suggest. But they will still visit the knapweed. And I think more and more, these late seasons, we're seeing more of our invasive plants are some of the only flowering plants. So they can be important for the native bees. As far as are the non-native bees, by pollinating, increasing weed species, I don't know. I haven't actually thought about that from the other way around. That's a really good question too. Yes.
I have an observation. I use the purple vetch as a cover crop in my gardens, and the bumblebees are all over that purple veg.
Yeah,
That's, you know, why I encounter them mostly. Just
that's great to hear, yeah. Got a little bit of purple fetch in my yard and they visit that as well. I've noticed they really like the raspberry plants too, both the wild and the native raspberries. Yes.
How do the bees use the nectar versus the pollen?
They feed on both, but the pollen is something they can collect and bring back to the colonies.
And the nectar they don't, they just consume it.
Right.
How far are they going to need from the nest site to forage?
You know, nobody knows enough about all the species to know different species, but there was a study in Europe, I think it was in Great Britain, where they put some tracking, they attracted bees. I forget how. But what I do remember is that bees traveled many miles from their original site. I think what they actually did now that I think about it, I think they drove the bee out. Actually, they kept driving it further and further. That's what they did. And then those bees returned and they had this kind of maximum different distance of how far they finally went before the bee kept coming home. And it was miles.
Okay, so they could follow elevation to an extent.
They do.
As the flowering.
Yeah, and that's actually been something I have really hoped to try to learn more about, as we're wondering once huckleberries done flowering, there's not a lot of other flowering plants in those immediate sites. It'd be great to know how far both those bees are traveling from the nesting sites to the huckleberries and from the huckleberries to the nests. Their nests are really hard to find. And we have actually tried putting tracking devices on them very unsuccessfully, even with the smallest size transmitters that some other people elsewhere have had success with. Yeah.
You mentioned a student, I think, that was trying to basically be able to identify species by pollen, like physical characteristics. Can you do that with DNA?
That is actually another thing that people are looking into. I think it's using the rDNA, and that there has been a little bit of work on that, and definitely something I think that's going to increase. I've also been thinking more and more like you could like cut just some of those fuzzy bristles right off the bee body and send it in for DNA. You could most definitely start having some really good information on species, but you know, first have to have the kind of bank of information.
Could they still live? Do you think you could shave off some hairs and allow them to live? Wondering, or you're saying
if that might be something, or you know, I know with some of the other like insects and even vertebrate animals, sometimes people take like a little piece of a tail or a foot or something, you know, as a way that they can look at DNA. You know, we're using animal hair, so I think that the bristles.
So like, would you have to pull it out? I don't know
I
quite
don't
what the
know,
bristles are.
but it's yeah, something I've wondered. Yeah.
Unrelated question. Is this ultimately still trying to, I think when I talked with Tabitha years ago, she was like, the goal was to try to make a predictive model for huckleberry production, right? Yes. Because it's such a like resource. Is this still trying to relate to that? Is that still part of the overall goal?
Last year was kind of the last year here on the Flathead Reservation that we continued running the cameras and the actual measurements of the plants and so forth. We did feed that information back to Tabitha, who I think is also really scaled back the work she's doing on the same run, but she has done some modeling and looking at some of that different information, and I'm not sure if she's where she is as far as publishing that right now.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely worth reaching out to her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So out of the bees that you've worked with, what has been your favorite one that
oh man.
Yeah.
All these cute little fuzzy bodies.
Yeah.
What would be my most favorite? I've got to say it's super exciting to get the Western bumblebee because we know they're rare and we don't see very many of them. So that might be my favorite, just based on both that you don't see them a lot, and they have that really cute white rump, of course. Far back there.
You know, have you guys looked at any correlation between, you know, we have good huckleberry year crop, we have lousy ones, you know, with that correlated in any effect in any way with, okay, there's more bees or less bees, or here we have very damp spring, and the bees aren't going to fly, and you know, plants those pies? Anybody looked at that?
I don't think we have enough information to really know, but I do think it plays, just based on observational stuff, I think it definitely makes a difference. And it's kind of a balance because huckleberries seem to do well growing, their growth seems to do well when you have good snowpack and precipitation. And then also, as you say, if you've got a lot of cold season, wet weather, the bumblebees aren't out as much, which I would certainly think, that it would be a balance, but not enough information to say kind of how much that would be. You had a question?
Well, I was curious, you talk about some of the uncertainties with identifying specific species and stuff like that, and I think that's, a common theme across entomology that it's difficult to identify things. So I guess I'm going to kind of ask you two questions. The first being, what is the process in which you're confirming the identity of a species? Like how who set the protocol to say this species is this to begin with? And how do you know that we are identifying individual species and not seeing different morphs across stuff that we're just not sure about. So I'm curious about that. And then where are they at with I guess populations of honeybees? That they talk about the western honeybee being endangered and such. To what certainty is the science on populations? I'm just curious because I haven't read up on this stuff.
No, this is really a great question. As far as kind of knowledge of bees and bee declines, it's depends on the species. We have species of bees that we just have no clue even how they're doing at all, data deficient. And then we have species where that's kind of based on places where people have recorded a lot of information through time, seeing declines in the numbers. So, you have a set of data over time where you've had a lot, where it starts spending less and less and less pretty quickly. And continues, to be on a downtrend. Sure. As far as species go, I'm guessing that there's very likely a lot of species that aren't separate species, and a lot of individuals that you would think were a separate species that would maybe turn out to be the same with more work. We're seeing that even with vertebrate animals, where as we have more and more genetic knowledge, that we're finding out that there's some of what we thought we knew were different species might not be.
Yeah. So is there not a documented way to collect DNA from an insect without killing it?
There's not a way that I
not invasively.
know of. I don't know of any right now. That doesn't mean there isn't. It means I haven't come across it and haven't had a lot of time to put into it either. So there might be, but yeah, that's the other way people, of course, get information is lethally killing insects and then getting the genetic information.
And then it's pretty certain though.
Right.
Well,
more so.
So there's still some.
Well, is that the basis at which they, these, I'm sorry, I forget the organization that did the Bee Atlas or whatever. Is that how they're differentiating species? Are they DNA certain, or
No, I think they're using the information from other people that have through time said this is a species, and so bee is a species. They're not doing actually the work of identifying it in that way themselves.
For identification, does wing venation play a role at all?
Yes. You look at bumblebee identification books, they talk about the wing venation as well, and it's different for different species. Have any online questions?
There is one. It says, do you know how much impact / competition there is between native bumbles and the introduced honeybees in prairies? Is there a known negative impact on pollen and nectar sources for bumbles because the generalist honeybees are more prevalent in using those resources? Could honeybees be negatively impacting some of the more specialist bumblebee species?
There is some concerns about that could be a problem in some places, in some situations with some of the native species. I'm not sure if there's enough information really to know how often or in all of the different conditions that it might be a concern. I definitely have seen where there's bumblebee or where there's a European honeybees at some of the flowers. We actually been doing photo observations that also are places that have honeybees. But the honeybees do tend to chase the other bees off. So I would say just based on that too, that there's some impact that we probably, aren't fully aware of. And then disease is a concern always too, as far as just moving things around, potentially moving diseases, mites, and things like that with the European honeybees into areas that they maybe could then also become concerned for the native bees.
And then another question, can you describe the camera setup you chose for the project?
Sure. We used cameras that had close focal lenses. And so there's a few different ones out there that you can find that will allow for that close focus because we're putting them pretty close to the huckleberry plants so that we can really see those flowers as they transform into berries through time. We made sure we had cameras that had time-lapse option so that we could set those cameras up where they would record some photos in the morning and then some photos in the evening. We did morning and evening because the light's different. And so trying to kind of get that window of time where you would get the best pictures. So I think that's what we wanted to know.
Yeah. I believe that's all the questions. I just wanted to hold
We got a
this.
question in the back here.
How good are we getting at determining what is the causation behind fatality in all bees? In other words, what killed this hive? What?
Not great. I think there's still a lot of not known.
Any resources available to the people that raise bees that are losing hives, that they can bring bees in and go, hey, what killed this?
I bet there are. I don't know what those would be. My first thought would be probably like the U.S. Department of Agriculture would be the place to look to see if they have some option with one of their research centers that they would take, bees that are of concern. But I'm not sure who does. Does anyone else know? Anyone do that? Yeah, I would guess if you looked around, there almost certainly are some people that are.
Yeah. Did any of the bees that you guys were able to photograph have any mites or diseases that you could notice?
We don't know of any diseases. We regularly saw different mites. Most mites probably aren't a big deal. It's, they're living on them and they're probably not going to do much to them. Mites in large numbers, though, can be pretty impacting. And then, of course, there's some concern, just like ticks for us, that a mite might carry a disease with it. Yes. Big question about that.
Can you remove mites from these?
What's that?
Can you remove mites from these?
I never have, but I would guess that you could. I sometimes we brush them, they do come off, but I don't know if we're like removing them if they're already loose. Good question.
Like in mentioning the huckleberries and bears, if that's kind of how you started the industrial bees, I was wondering with the bees threatened and potentially endangered, who else like in their cycle is going to be strongly impacted? Is that known already? Like how much will huckleberries decline and then bears, or like are there strong correlates already known and concerning them?
Not really. No, I think at this point we have enough bumblebees doing well enough in the areas where we have huckleberry that we're still having the huckleberries that numbers that are still available for all the different animals we're feeding on them. There is some research showing huckleberries declining all around, but how much of that's tied to all these different factors out there that could lead to change? Even just things like differences in habitat, differences in how native people manage patches and burned in areas to keep them open for huckleberry plants. All of these different things that tie in. I don't think there's any kind of strong way to know just how much it matters as far as like a big picture piece of our bumblebees, if they were to decline, totally be gone. Yeah, it'd be a big deal, I think, tenfold and varies, but we still have enough bees out there. But if they can pollinate the plants, they're still able to do so in most cases.
This might be a question for you. So you were counting seeds and like seed size. Is that the, what is the primary way that huckleberries actually reproduce? Why is seed size? I mean, why were you interested in that so much?
It's not a question.
You.
Erin is a great helper in counting seeds. A lot of huckleberry reproduction is underground too, in rhizomes.
Because you see patches, just entire slopes.
Right, so yeah, how much the seeds, I mean, viable seeds can grow new plants. I think it's a really slow process too, from what I understand. And, you know, so whether that would really make a big impact seed-wise or not to plant growth, it's more of a question of, you know, the difference that might happen with pollination. Yes.
On your slide or the picture, there it says Friday, April 8th, seed grab and go poll. Where?
That is a question for our Lake County Conservation District folks.
Yeah, so we are hosting our pollinator week next week, where if you want to help support the bees, yeah, you can get some free seeds if you're a Lake County resident, which I'm assuming all of you are. If not, Missoula and all the other districts have it too. But we do have these events next week. And if none of these work for you, you can also reach out and we can plan another date for you to come pick up seed. But yeah, Tuesday we have pollinator trivia at the Ronan Brewery. And we will have seed there available. And then Wednesday we have another pollinator trivia at Glacier Brewery. And then Thursday there'll be a seed grab and go, and that'll be at our office, the Conservation District office in Ronan. And then Friday, there'll be another one in Polson. And those, Thursday and Friday, it's gonna be 12 to 5, I believe. And also Friday night, we're gonna have a pollinator happy hour. It'll be wine you can come and get for free. We will accept donations. And yeah, I believe there'll be honey and lots of other good stuff there. Yeah, any question?
Polson doesn't have a conservation district office, does it?
No, it does. It's in Ronan, and that covers all of Lake County.
Okay, so then.
So, and oh yeah, so the Polson Bay, that's going to be at the Flathead Lakers office, right next to the Mexican restaurant, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll be, and there's like lots of information over here. And if y'all have any questions, I'm happy to help out with that after this.
Thanks.
Yeah, if anyone has any other questions. Oh, great. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.